Eicha, the Book of Lamentations, is the central text that we chant on Tisha B'Av, as most of you know. And I want to admit, and I hope I'm not the only one, that this text often seems kind of impervious to me. Part of it is the intensity of the holiday and sitting and listening to it be chanted. I've not always been present and trying to think about what it means. And what Shani drew out for us is that there are these incredibly challenging images in the text that in many ways make use of women's bodies as a way of expressing national disaster. And we've brought together an incredible panel to think about what this means and if this is a text that should be canceled because of the challenges of how it uses women's bodies and women's imagery, or if it's a text that can be resurrected. So with no more ado, I want to introduce our panel for today. We have Rabba Shani Gross, who is the Director of North American Programs for Pardes North America and is an amazing teacher and creative visionary. We have Rabbi Dianne Cohler Esses, who is the first female rabbi ordained from the Syrian Jewish community. Her smicha, her ordination, is from JTS, the Jewish Theological Seminary. She serves as the Associate Rabbi and Director of Lifelong Learning at Romemu, and she co-teaches a class at the Arts Beit Midrash at the Skirball Institute. And she is a sought-after teacher and facilitator and scholar in residence for many Jewish organizations. We have Rabbi Megan GoldMarche, who is the rabbi at Base in Chicago, in Metro Chicago. She is also a JTS ordained rabbi and a Wexner Fellow. Megan is a proud Pardes alumna. And if I can gush for half a second, I spent many years as the director of Hillel at Penn. And Megan, my first year at Penn, was an outstanding, life-changing student leader. And it's so great to see all the amazing things she's doing now as a colleague and a scholar and a teacher. And we have Tamar Biala, who is a Jewish studies scholar with a master's in women's and Jewish studies from the Schechter Institute in Jerusalem. She co-edited a volume of women's Midrash on the Bible, and she's currently working with the Al Kanarak on a project called Torah, a regendered version of the Tanakh, of the Bible. We'll be able to sample some of this today. And she teaches at various Batei Midrash and rabbinical schools and adult education programs in the US and Israel. Tamar is joining us today from Israel in the very last hour of the fast. And so if she stutters or inverts any words, please forgive her. She's running on empty here, but she promised she would rally. And I also, before we turn it over to Shani, just want to thank our sponsors for today, Base Hillel, Romemu, and Yeshivat Maharat. So with that, I'll turn it over to Rabba Shani Gross.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mike. I find Tisha B'Av really hard for a lot of reasons, mainly because I love to say hi and welcome people, and it's really hard. It's really awkward to not do that. So I'm not welcoming you. I have not said hello. So I figured it would make sense to just give a brief background and grounding to the conversation today, to give a little background on Megillat Eicha, the text that many of us may have sat on the floor and heard last night. And just a credit to Dr. Yael Ziegler, who is not on this panel, but is a senior lecturer on Tanakh, who lives in Israel and recently published a book on Megillat Eicha, and who informed a lot of what I'm going to say in the next few minutes. Megillat Eicha is a work made up of 5 prakim, 5 chapters. It offers no date, but it claims to be an eyewitness account of the destruction of the first temple in 586 BCE. The book also does not identify an author, though there's a strong tradition that Yirmiyahu, the prophet Jeremiah, composed it, although there are many scholars who also argue that there are multiple authors to this text. And in Dr. Ziegler's words, she explains Megillat Eicha is by no means a historical account of events, as it lacks narrative, dates, or identified persons. It does not attempt to relate a prose account of Jerusalem's fall or Babylon's conquest. Rather than a book of theology, Eicha is a book of human ordeals. Instead of offering solutions, the book portrays an emotional experience, suggesting that the raw human response to suffering is itself a religious affair. And I'll just share my screen. You should have all gotten the source sheet for our panel, but it's hard not to notice when reading Eicha how much of that emotional raw energy is very much channeled via really graphic language, very often at the expense of women. And these are just some examples. There were honestly many that I could have put in the source sheet. The first obvious example is when we refer to, we analyze the city of Jerusalem, of Yerushalayim, as a woman, like a nida haitad, like a menstruating woman, who is sitting tumata bishulaha, that she's sitting in the uncleanliness of her skirts. Everyone has seen her nakedness, and there's so much imagery akin to rape. Specifically in verse 10 of the first chapter, Yado parash Sara kol machmadaha kira'ata goyim ba'u miktasha. So the foe has laid hands on her, on everything dear to her. She has seen her sanctuary invaded by nations. And I don't know if the right word is to say even more graphic or equally just troubling is the verses in which we're describing women eating their own babies, infanticide, as we see in chapter 2 and even harder in chapter 4, where we're told, Yedei nashim rachmaniot bishlu yaldehen, with their own hands, tender-hearted women have cooked their children. And I think that something that Mike and I discussed is the fact that, we sort of stumble into reading Eicha. Tisha B'Av is this one-day holiday, kind of comes smack in the middle of the summer. There's not a lot of time, I don't think most of us spend a lot of time learning Eicha in advance, because it's such a strange and intense text. And then we sort of stumble into this text that was written either by one man or multiple men, very likely, and has this really just over the top graphic language. I feel as a parent of two beautiful children, I feel fairly confident that while I can't imagine the difficulty that was actually going on in this time, that most women would sooner feed their own body to their child than ever consume their own child. And I think because this is not trying to be a historical text or claiming to be one, it's sort of, have a text that is employing or exploiting women's pain and suffering, and just in general having over-the-top graphic language. And in today's times, what do we do with a text like this? And so that was the background and sort of the intention that we thought of when we decided to put on this panel. And so with that, I'm going to hand it back to Mike.
Johnny, great. Thank you so much. So we're going to start with sending a question to each of our panelists and giving about 5 or 10 minutes for them to respond. Then we have a few other questions, and we'll be opening it up to questions from those of you who've logged on. So if things are coming up that you want us to return to, you can message the group. You can hold on to it until we get to that point in the panel. But the last 20 minutes or so, we'll have room for Q&A from everyone else on the call today as well. So I just want to say one last thing, that we have people with various titles on the panel, and it's very much a Pardes style that people go by first name. So even though we have rabbis and scholars and professional educators on the panel, we'll be using first names throughout. So beginning with Dianne, one other introductory comment. We asked the 3 panelists both what their beliefs are about this text, but also we kind of nudged them into certain boxes to create a tension and dynamic on the panel. So those boxes are both reflections of how they feel and think, but also somewhat artificial. And so just please give all the panelists the benefit of the doubt that there's more nuance than the role that we've asked them to play. And there may be moments where they step out of that role as well. So Dianne, we're going to start with you. And the options that we kind of put people in were, is this a text that can be kept and maintained? That's the role that Dianne's playing. Megan is playing the role that this is a text that should be canceled. And Tamar is playing the role that this text can be reclaimed or changed. So we're going to start with you, Dianne. And I have a two-part question for you to help frame your first opening statement, which is there an argument to be made in defense of Eicha, that it is a necessary text and a way of giving us a chance to express this deep and intense despair that needs to come out? And the second part of the question is, are there other instances in our present moment in life where it might be important to highlight what we at times might feel like gratuitous pain as a tool for sending a message? So Dianne, I'll open it to you.
Thank you so much. And I so appreciate this panel. While it's not making me happy because it's Tisha B'Av, it does feel nourishing on this day of grief. And to have an opportunity, the fact that the tradition gives us an opportunity for grief and for the fullness of that expression, I just want to say, first of all, that I really value that. So just to situate myself very, very briefly, as you heard, I come from the Syrian community. I've traversed all kinds of Jewish worlds. I went to JTS, and I now am a conservative rabbi who works in a renewal synagogue. So, I've really sort of just traversed, journeyed throughout the Jewish world, and throughout, the one constant for me, except for a few years where I'm a complete rebel, was the Torah. And I love the Torah, and I will, even if it hurts me and even if I hate it, I will defend it with my life, I guess. And I think that's what I'm doing in my work, is defending it with my life. So I will say a few things. Eicha is not advocating rape, God forbid, or the exploitation or the pain of women, or the diminishment, the degradation of women. It's using a woman to express intense, intense pain and anguish. And I compare it to our moment. I cannot help but compare it to our moment. I had a conversation with Shani about this, or Shani. I'm really trying to grapple, although it's so hard because it's so incomprehensible, the climate change crisis that we're in at this moment. And in giving a Dvar Torah recently, I talked about the earth as an ancient woman an ancient mother who's very, very ill. But I would also say, possibly, it wouldn't be the only symbol I would use, that she's a woman that we've exploited, but a mother that we've been exploited, devalued, and maybe even raped with our actions. So how do we find language for disaster? How do we find language for, the destruction of our world? Often my students will say to me, and I do a lot of adult education, will say, how can we believe in a God like this when we see when we read text in the Torah and we see God can be angry and punishing, although there's really a vast array of images of God, but that's for a different panel. And I often turn the question back to them, is what do you think people were experiencing that they would want to tell a story about God that looks like this text? Like, what experience is behind this text? And I think it's crucial for us to right now touch that grief and touch that anguish. It reminds me of this amazing poem by Amichai, the Israeli poet who died, I think, in the year 2000, who wrote, "From the book of Esther, I filtered the sediment of vulgar joy, and from the book of Jeremiah, the howl of pain in the guts." And perhaps the book of, maybe he was also including Eicha, I'm not sure. And from the Song of Songs, the endless search for love. And from the book of Genesis, the dreams in Cain. And from Ecclesiastes, the despair. And from the book of Job, Job. And with what was left, I pasted myself a new Bible. Now I live censored and pasted and limited and in peace. I don't want to live censored and limited and in peace. I see a world that's full of violence. I see a world that's tragic. I see personal tragedy. I see collective tragedy. I see global tragedy. You know, I feel bad I'm being so negative, but it is Tisha B'Av. And I want a Torah that reflects what I bear witness to in the world. It doesn't always do it in the way that I like to, but I want to say this, which is the Torah is not there to silence us. It's the beginning of a conversation, not the end of one. It doesn't rob us of our voices. We can always speak back. We can always frame it. We can always contextualize it, which I think is part of what we're doing today. We can write Midrash. We can reverse the gender in the Torah, as Yael Kanarak and Tamar are doing. It doesn't render us powerless. And if it does, it's not the book I want. It's not the sacred book I want. So if I have time, I will read one more thing. Yeah, we're doing okay. Okay. So many of you know Rachel Adler, the feminist theologian, who early on in her career wrote of mikveh and really gave us an idealized kind of romantic view of mikveh. And then she kind of took it back about 20 years later in 1997. And there she wrote an article in Tikkun where she wrestles with the violence, or reckons with the violence of Ezekiel. And she writes this, which I think is perfect for this moment. Sacred need not mean inerrant. It is enough for the sacred to be inexhaustible. In the depths of your Torah, I seek you out, Eheyeh, creator of a world of blood. I tear your Torah verse from verse until it is broken and bleeding just like me. Over and over, I find you in the bloody fragments. Beneath even the woman-hating words of Ezekiel, I hear you breathing. In your blood, live. And I would say that, as difficult as it is to read, and Mike, I had a similar experience to you last night, listening to Eicha being read, like, how do I process this? How do I hear it? How do I even understand what it means? And yet I feel like that voice of anguish and horror is exactly the voice we need to listen to at this moment, and exactly the kind of voice that we need to figure out how to voice ourselves. Like, how do we bear witness? With what voices, with what metaphors, and with what symbols do we bear witness to what is happening in our very own time? Siyanti.
Dianne, thank you so much. What a great start. Megan, so you're playing the role of Cancel. And I'm wondering, is it important for us to all have this painful experience? Like, did we have to, as Jews or as humans, be forced to confront these ideas and to feel this pain? And the other question is, are there other ways that you could imagine teaching, chanting, approaching a text like Eicha than the way we've inherited it? So Megan, we'll turn it to you.
Great. Thank you, Mike. And thank you, Dianne and Shani. I am just honored to be here. Not happy. I know that's against the rules, but honored to be here with all of you. Just to situate myself for a moment, I'm definitely approaching this as an educator of primarily young, sort of 20s, 30s, less affiliated Jews, people who aren't necessarily coming from day school backgrounds. So that when I think about sort of how I think where this text is read and my own teaching experience, that's sort of my vantage point. And so in preparing for this and talking to Shani, the first thing that came to mind is I imagine this is true for a lot of us. My first experiences of Eicha were at summer camp. It's the only holiday that falls during the summer camp cycle. And so camps really play it up because it's all we got besides Shabbat. And it's dark. And I have this memory of probably being, 12 or 13, weaving in circles into a dark room with candles lit, music playing, sitting down, listening to chanting. I have no idea what they chanted. I mean, I do know because now I know what Eicha was, but at the time I had no idea. I think they handed us booklets. And to me, that is what I'm advocating for canceling. I do not think we can hand teenagers or preteens or anybody who doesn't have context Eicha in a ritual that doesn't explain what's going on. And I think it's deeply irresponsible, it's not that education isn't done around the destruction of the temple. I think camps actually do fascinating, strong education on what it means to relate to the experience of loss. But the text of Eicha is not part of that education usually, because as Shani sort of mentioned, it's not a narrative that is conducive to teaching about the moment. It's a narrative that's conducive to, as Diane said, teaching emotions. And especially in the way Eicha is used, we have to do that more responsibly. So that's my cancel argument. I'm sorry to the summer camps who probably all just did that last night. But it to me seems really problematic. And the first I'll say is I agree that, Diane, the way you talked about the story of women and women as those who have been oppressed can be a useful metaphor. To me, the most problematic part of this metaphor is that Jerusalem is really blamed for her own pain. There's a real sense that the sins of the people put on Jerusalem, the woman, are responsible for what happened. And she is a victim who maybe even deserves what she's experiencing. And I understand theologically why that's necessary for the Israelites who are trying to understand their own predicament. But to read it in that way and not acknowledge that, unlike the earth where we say we did this to her, she did this to herself, that to me is the most kind of problematic message. So I guess to answer your questions, Mike, the two pieces, one is, do we all need to have, a painful experience? And I do truly believe we need the Jewish tradition to give us places to experience grief. But this, I think we've learned more and more educationally over the last, at least 5 to 10 years where I've been working with young adults who I think have been leading us in this. Those people who have experienced more trauma, more oppression, this might push them over the edge into a grief where they will be debilitated and actually won't be able to have empathy, relate. This may be the opposite of what they need. And so I think it's deeply possible that the rabbis who initially created this tradition did need this. And I think there may be some gender to that this might be the right message for men, but not all men. A lot of men experience incredible oppression, and maybe for some women, but definitely not all women. And so to think about what is actually going to be the educational experience that's going to bring us to a place of empathy for our ancestors, empathy for people who have experienced things like this, and also just allowing us to feel depressed. I think this past year and a half has been a lot more permission for people to feel down and depressed because we've been living in sort of a state of anguish collectively. But for a lot of us, we're expected to be cheery all the time. Shani, I'm with you. I always want to greet people and hug people. I think for some people, Tisha B'Av is the best day of the year because they never want to have to be that on. And it's permission to just be down and say, like, it's not a good day and I don't want to pretend it's a good day. And we need to do that, but I'm not sure this text will do this for everybody. The one, comparison I've been thinking about, and Shani and I talked about a little bit, is this comparison with Yom HaShoah, and this idea that I do think on Yom HaShoah, I at least try to force myself to read really painful Holocaust memorial. If I'm not hearing from a survivor directly, reading pieces. And that's a choice I make. There's no set way one has to observe Yom HaShoah, and therefore you can sort of choose educationally what's going to work for you. Where with Eicha, even though I didn't really want to, I sat and listened to Eicha last night because that's what we're supposed to do. And so there's a piece there. To your last point, Mike, this question of are there better ways? Obviously, there's better ways, and I think Pardes is sort of modeling a lot of that. In some ways, I think summer camps, could actually spend an entire week before leading up studying. I think you could do the exact same ritual we do with the right preparation of examining, of understanding the theology that led to the text, obviously in age-appropriate ways, thinking about all the things that, at least the traditional community, people start preparing 3 weeks out, not eating meat, not drinking wine, having a minor fast day before. But for most people that I work with, all they see is Tisha B'Av. They don't see any of those other pieces. And so to think about what might be done in the 3 weeks leading up to sort of emotionally prepare ourselves to understand, I think we could be reading modern survivor narratives of genocides, which I think probably these texts really relate, people could really relate to pieces of that. So that's one piece. I think just learning the text. If you don't live in a community that feels halachically bound to read the whole thing and you can do it in one day, you know, having a Beit Midrash where we really study and we read commentary and we put together really full source sheets that allow us to understand, again, theological underpinnings, some of the modern ways to think about it. I think also I've seen done very well in some of the communities I'm part of is after certain chapters, having people share reactions. The problem really is that can lead to a 3 or 4 hour event. I think about that with Megillat Esther too. These texts are just too long for good education. And, you know, that's why I do think sometimes we have to cancel our obligation to read the entire thing, which might actually work the educational goals, where if we pick certain pieces and really go deep into them and make space for us to study and learn interpretations, people might actually achieve the end goal better. And then the last piece I think we could do right now, which wouldn't require much, is I remember the first time I realized that when people read the curses in Devarim, how they read the curses really quickly and quietly. And I think intentionally communities could pick certain verses to read differently. And even that and naming it in advance would just make a point that I think could go very far. So just a number of ideas that people want to explore. Excited to make this, not excited today, excited tomorrow to discuss ways to make this a more deeply meaningful educational experience. So thank you.
Megan, thank you. And thank you for everyone who are chatting, comments, and questions. I'm keeping track as we go. And Megan, just to say thank you also, like it's such an interesting thing that you did at the end to take a tool that we have that's a well-worn tool, which is to change the way something's chanted, to whisper it, to I'm thinking of pieces of Birka Hamazon also that we're supposed to not sing joyously, as a way of intentionally naming some of these tensions and contextualizing them in the ritual without necessarily changing the ritual entirely. Great, so we're gonna turn it over to Tamar now. And Tamar is playing the role of reclaim and change, which she's eminently suited to do because as I said during the introduction, she has created a version of Eicha that flips the genders, which is like the definition of reconstructing a ritual in a text to make it fit in contemporary life more. So she's going to read a piece of that for us as an answer to the question of how can we reclaim or reinterpret Eicha. And would also love, Tamar, if you'll share with us what came up for you as you were rewriting Eicha. How did swapping the genders affect your understanding of the text? So I'll turn it over to you, Tamar.
Thank you. So I'll begin with saying that Eicha is a soft violence because other prophets are using the women's bodies in a much, much worse dimension. And the trauma that I had from Ezekiel 16 didn't leave me for years. And I did try to deal with this through a Midrash. And for a while, I thought maybe I understand why it's still in the Bible. But then I realized that when we include in the Bible texts that are really horrifying morally, doesn't have to be only patriarchal texts, other texts, and we still call our Torah, this is our Kodesh, and we go to shul every week and looking for inspiration. And even though around the Shabbos table we analyze it to pieces and scream, it's still Kodesh for us, which means there is some legitimacy in the back of our head, in the subconscious place in us, that these things can be named, can be called holy. So Eicha is problematic, but believe me, there are worse things that I'm trying to deal with over the years. So as it was mentioned before, Yael Kenerick, my friend, 5 years ago started rewriting the Tanakh again. I joined her and we did already Chamisha Chumshei Torah and other Megillot, few Megillot and prophets. And now I would like to share with you just the first few psukim from Eicha and feel how it sounds. This is still the same story, like all the things that we did in the Torah. So it still invites us to talk about infliction and pain, like Diane was looking for, but from a different perspective, I'm not sure all feminists would feel that this is a feminist thing to do, because all the women that we will meet are horrible. The divine is a female, and she's the harshest divine I've ever met. And Am Israel now, his name is Tisraela. Yerushalayim, is a male, and its name is Terush Lema. And we will see how man is mourning for his pain and the infliction that women do to him. So give me a second and I'll show slowly. Eicha yashav badad, העיר רביעם היה כאלמן, רבי בגויות, שרי במדינות, היה למס. בכו יבכה בלילה, ודמעתו על לחיו, אין לו מנחמת מכל אוהבותיו. כל רעותיו בגדובו, היו לו לאויבות. גלה תהודה מעוני ומרוב עבודה, הוא ישב בגויות, לא מצא מנוח. כל רודפותיו השיגו בין המצרים. דחי ציונה ולוט, מבלי באות מועד, כל שעריו שוממין, כהנותיו נאנחות, בתוליו נוגים, והוא מר לו. היו צרותיו, לראש אויבותיו שאלו, כי תהובה הוגתו על רוב פשעיו, עוללותיו, הלכו שבי לפני צרה. ויצא מבין ציונה כל הדרו, היו שרותיו, כאיילות לא מצאו מרעה, ותלכנה ולא כוח לפני רודפת. זכר תרוש למה, ימי עוניו ומרודיו, כל מחמודיו, אשר היו מימי קדם. בנפול עמו ביד צרה, ואין עוזרת לו, ראו צרות, שחקו על משפטיו. חטא חטא תרוש למה, על כן לנידי היה. כל מכבדותיו הזילו כי ראו ערוותו, גם הוא נאנח, וישוב אחור. טומאתו ושוליו, לא זכר אחריתו, וירד פלאים, אין מנחמת לו. ראי תהובה את עוני, כי הגדילה אויבת. ידע פרסה צרה, על כל מחמדיו. כי ראה גויות באו מקדשו, אשר ציווית, לא תבונה בקהל לך. So whoever wants it, I can give you the whole Megillah. We did the same thing for other, I told you the Chamisha Chomshei Torah and other Megillot. And the question is, so what does it provide that a Midrash can provide, or other 2,000 years of commentary and, you know, doing anything that we could have ever done to that Tanakh didn't do. So one of us was mentioning before that we look for our experiences in the Tanakh to be honest and to deal with reality, and especially with unjust in the world, through the Tanakh. It forces us to deal with horrible questions that otherwise, if we would have written a Tanakh ourselves, wouldn't dare touching. So it's true that we squeezed a lot, and we should go on squeezing more. I do believe as a feminist that we should work on all fronts, and women should write Midrash and send the Midrashim to me, because I do tend to publish more and more volumes of Midrashim by women. But it's not enough, because the Tanakh do not I don't know, to express or portray my experience at all. And I wasn't even aware of how much it doesn't express until Yael and I did the reverse Bible, and I heard new voices about what is it to be a woman. For instance, in Megillat Eicha, or all the project of Torah, women are not victims. This is the only book I've ever read, including all the science fiction I read over the years. It's the only book that is not patriarchal at all. Even subconsciously, it's not patriarchal. It's just the opposite. Women have all the power, and the divine is a woman, and she addresses women. She demands from them. She relates to them. They present. They can do everything. It's very confusing, and they do a lot of horrible things. Horrible. They rape. They do gilui arayot. You know, they murder nations. Then they hurt each other a lot. Kina is killing Hevla right at the beginning. I mean, we all know the story, but when it's opposite, it's really confusing. The way now, Shani, you said, how can it be that mothers would eat their children? We know that it's not our experience. So who has written this, and what did they thought of women? The way whatever Chazal ever wrote about women is not what women would say about themselves and how they see themselves. So what I need is an Eicha, actually, that will talk about a woman experience. Maybe another Eicha should have been written, because the woman in the original Eicha is not me. But I can say that through Eicha, in the opposite Eicha, that talks about Yerushalayim as a male, Yerushalema as this morning man, I learned that I can do so much bad things to men, and that men should have room to scream their PTSD. At least in Israel, last year there was a new series on TV about the 73 war, Milchemet Yom Kippur, Valley of Tears, I think was the name of this series. Suddenly, thousands and thousands of new people with PTSD understood that they have PTSD and went to seek for help. So that's what, when I read the first time the opposite Eicha, I was hearing this movie once again. Oh my God, folks around me are all sick with PTSD. So I have to say, when Yehuda, my husband, heard this chapter, he also had tears in his eyes, and he said, finally, we have room to cry, and it's not a shame for the tear to drop there. So this is Eicha. Eicha should have, I mean, the Jewish people should have several Tanachim on their shelves, and people should use whatever Tanakh they need that year. And one last thing, apropos writing new texts. Last night in shul, my daughter was sitting beside me. My young daughter is autistic, and she suffers in shul like you can't believe. She's coming only for Kriyot Megillah, you know, on Purim, and even on Rosh Hashanah, I'm not sure I'll be able to bring her. And I was thinking, maybe it's about time to write Megillat Eicha from someone with special needs perspective. Maybe it won't be Eicha, it would be a different book. It would be a different Megillah. Each chapter would be from the voice of a different person with a different special need. And they will describe to us their experience in life, their existential experience, their theology, their moral demands or pain. So our Tanakh is so limited, and it's about time to add more Tanachim.
Great. Tamar, thank you so much. And just with the few verses that you chanted for us, we get such a powerful glimpse of approaching the same text, but with a totally different lens and all the new levels of meaning that can be revealed in it. I want to ask a few follow-up questions to the panel before we take questions from everyone else on the call today. And just to kind of underscore, a bunch of people mentioned this in the chat, and as panelists, you mention it, that there are pieces of the text that don't ring true to you as a woman. It's clear that it's written from a male voice. Specifically, folks pointed out about mothers eating their babies. That might have been a useful metaphor for men, but it doesn't ring true to female ears. The other piece that that Rachel on Amaru pointed out is that, that Janice pointed out in the chat, was that part of what's challenging and problematic about the text is that when these male authors want to come up with an image of something that is vulnerable, that's something that's fragile, that's that the imagery is feminine imagery, that seems to be a very simple connection, that a city that is breached and invaded and destroyed, that it's very quick in their minds to make that link to femininity. And I just wanted to hear kind of a short answer from folks, because I think you added a lot of nuance, but like that, though the challenges created by that dynamic, it sounds like no one is really advocating that this is a text that should be erased, or that we should ignore it consciously because it propagates these negative images of femininity as weak, passive, fragile, v'chule, on and on and on. And I guess here's the question I want to ask. If you were talking with a younger person who is very active in social justice and in trying to correct the language that we use and to correct the images that we use in our society, and this is a young person who sees like, when there's something tarnished by racism or misogyny or homophobia or some kind of discrimination, those images should be washed out. Those statues should be ripped down. Those authors should be diminished. And if they said to you, to the folks on the panel, but like, I think we should do the same to Eicha. We should get rid of it. This is a moment we have where we can wipe out these voices that diminished and weakened women. And this is a text that's irreparably broken. And if you're in favor of tearing down statues of Confederate generals, right? This is, again, Tamar, for American Civil War metaphor, right? People who are kind of recognized leaders in American racism. Why would you not be for also ripping down this because of the misogynistic images of women? And so what answer would you give a young person who sees a contrast between how you're responding to a sacred text versus how many people in our society today are responding to everything else that's kind of outdated and propagating ideas that we want to uproot? So Dianne, do you want to lead us off?
I do.
Sorry, it was a very long question. I apologize.
It was very long. So I'll answer a piece of it, and then I might ask you to sort of ask the beginning part of the question again. But the Confederate statues to me are completely different. Our society has glorified them. This book does not want, Bat Zion to be degraded and raped and exploited. It's not what it's calling for. It's calling for the opposite. It's ruining, it's decrying this condition, right? I mean, it's not like it's saying, oh, here's this image of a woman being raped, let's raise it up. It's exactly the opposite. So I don't see the connection. I just don't see that connection. That's number one. Number two, what's interesting, are there any images in the book that don't ring true to me? I approach that question with humility because I've never starved. I've never lived through a war. I've lived through a pandemic in a completely privileged, way. I mean, luckily I didn't get COVID, but living with my family in my apartment and not having to go to work, I've been completely privileged. So I stand with humility before this text. I don't know if it doesn't ring true to me, maybe, because I have no clue what they went through. I have no clue. Did I miss part of the question?
No, it was great. And Dianne, I love what you were saying about the humility. It's something that often comes up in my family at Passover Seders around things like Shvo Chamarcha, which is, it's like these things, just your knee-jerk response to say they're offensive, but none of us had ever lived through a situation where people are trying to kill us. And what
offensive, and life can be offensive. You know what I mean? It's problematic, it's troubling. Yes, it's problematic and troubling. Yes. And so how are we going to deal with that? So for me, it's not, again, by excising it. I clearly have feelings about this.
Great, thank you. And Megan, how do you answer those questions that Dianne just responded to?
Yeah, I mean, I think what she said about the Confederate statues, to me, it's not a totally failed metaphor. I think it's just, to me, if we, again, just read Eicha and don't talk about it at all, that's like sticking a Confederate statue somewhere, as opposed to, I don't think people would advocate for getting rid of Civil War history from our books. To me, this is a part of understanding who we are, of understanding where we came from. And I would hope, though I don't know if this is totally true, but I do work with a lot of those folks, that they would understand that sometimes we have to learn things that are painful to learn, because as Dianne said, the world is painful. And if we don't learn those things, we can't prevent them. We can't understand who we are. But it's how we do them. It's the context, it's giving background, it's understanding. And I also, fully agree that what might resonate for me doesn't resonate for other people. So we can't just have an educator pick out and say, great, we're going to learn this, this, and this. And I think that's partially why. I mean, if we were just going to throw out everything in Judaism that was deeply offensive to somebody, we'd have almost nothing left. And so we make a commitment, to love our tradition and to believe that it has a lot more good than bad within it. And what I'll often say to people is, we are the inheritors as much as the people who think it's perfect as it is. And so if we are the inheritors of it, we have to take it and wrestle with it and make it work. Otherwise, we're letting those people win. And I don't want to let them win because I love Judaism. I want us to win. So, eventually, once Tamar's rewritten enough versions of all of our texts, we're going to overtake everything else, and it's going to be beautiful.
Great, thank you. And Tamar, do you want to respond also? Oh yeah, Diane, did you want to?
Just very quickly, I so agree with Megan. Like, I love the point that you made. Like, what does violence is the unprocessed text, are not looking at our assumptions around the text. And I love that you're bringing up and raising up how we educate, how we present, how we contextualize. So thank you.
And before you go, Tamar, can I just add, I think what Megan and Diane, you just drew out is there's a very serious critique that you just made, implicit in how you said this, about the default assumption that people have about the meaning and purpose of text and tradition, which is it's not to submit to the text, it's not to read it literally or to worship at its feet, but that text only has meaning when it is pulled apart, when it's given context, and when living human beings are interacting and struggling with it. That's where the truth emerges, not from it in its static form. And I think that people who have been at Pardes, people who've had a chance to really engage in text study, have some sense that that's the purpose. But I think that there's many folks who have a knee-jerk reaction, assume that whether it's a text in the Siddur or something from the High Holiday Liturgy or from the Torah itself or from the Tanakh, that the purpose of it is just to put it in almost like a trophy case and appreciate its sacredness, not to take it out and kind of get into the muck with it. And Megan and Diane, that's really what you're advocating for, that it only comes alive and means something when you actually dig into it. Great. Tamar, do you want to respond as well?
Yeah. So I'll just say that I disagree with you. Of course, we're a culture of disagreement and machloket, all of this, and we mess with the texts, and nothing is. We don't want to do avodah zarah and to sanctify the texts without touching them. But just knowing that the Torah, the status of the Torah, is different than any other text, and subconsciously we still normalize patriarchy as something holy, even if we don't admit it and we don't want it. Then I want to describe to you how the gender roles in Eicha that are changing and in other biblical stories that we changed, what implication they had, how did it affect me. So I mentioned before the chapter in Ezekiel when Yerushalayim is a city that is prostitution, and God inflicts on her punishments for something like 60 verses in a row of sexual punishments by the other nations. And it's truly, I once taught it to a group of therapists, this chapter, and one of them said, 100% psychotic attack. I mean, this is insane. So this is, of course, we say it's bad, we don't want to legitimate, we'll bring it to shul to teach people how not to behave. But eventually, subconsciously, we know that theologically, the relationship between us and God, and eventually we are a woman, even though we don't have opposite examples. So I'll describe something that happened to me with Torah. In Torah, like you see in this chapter, women have power. And it's confusing because I'm used to be the victim and I had the moral high standard of a victim. And I also invented manipulations, how to deal in Judaism, I mean, in being as a victim, how to be angry with Chazal and exactly to know what should be banished from Chazal. I can tell you there's specific pages that have no just existential justification whatsoever in the Talmud. But not just that, it's the image in all cell of my body of a woman that lives in patriarchy, privileged as I am, life are not, so good as a woman in our world. And then with Torah, I couldn't understand how women can be achashdar paniyot. That was the first thing that we did, that I saw, Megillat Esther. Achashveroshni is choosing who, with all the betulim, all the virgin boys in the kingdom, what to do with them. I didn't even have the horizons to imagine it. Then we reached in Vatikra, Yudchet 18, the chapter of the incest, and I was reading this and I told Yael, it doesn't work. Logically, it doesn't work. Women can't do this. And she told me, oh yes. The day later, she sent me a pile of articles about women's incest, how women rape children. I didn't know it's a phenomena. I couldn't believe my eyes. And it said there in one of those articles that she sent me how boys don't complain because it doesn't fit their image, and how these women won't be punished appropriately because the judges have different images in their head. And then I realized, oh my God, I'm not a victim. I have more powers in me, unfortunately, to do bad, maybe also to do good. And I swear in God, I was walking in Derech Hebron under our apartment, and I was a different person. I felt that all the therapy ever didn't do for me what these, for good and for bad, Vatikra Yudchet did for me. Women can be more than we think. And I have to be morally responsible for my behavior because I can do much worse than I even imagine or admit. And men, I don't have to tell you, at least in Israel, men are still, they should, have room and legitimacy to be softer and to be better parents. And Torah is talking all about the vulnerability of men needing to have a daughter, because otherwise they don't have a, So this is what it's doing for me.
Thank you, Tamar. Folks, if you want to chat questions, I will try to work them in the last 15-20 minutes that we have together. And while folks are chatting their questions, I want to ask the panel a different question. And I want to expand the scope of the conversation a little bit and ask if you're willing to also speak a little bit personally here as well. But there's two sides to this question. You can do both or pick a side. One is around this question of like, is this just too much? Is this like too over the top in terms of the graphic nature of the trauma? And is it effective? Is it an effective way of getting people to feel this? And the question I wanted to ask to you all is, does it feel different now? The last few years have been very tumultuous. Obviously, COVID and all of the loss and trauma. There's been an awakening, at least in North America, about how dangerous and real anti-Semitism is in this country that was often overlooked, even though it was hiding in plain sight. There were issues, incredible issues tearing our country apart around gender and around race and the Me Too movement and Black Lives Matter. Again, it's a little bit North American centric, but I wonder if it feels different today. Like, do you have less tolerance for this kind of shock and awe approach to memorializing trauma than you might have 5 years ago? Or do you think it's more important now than ever? That's question one. And question two is, are there other things that you feel like you are lamenting, other losses right now, given how hard the past few years have been, that you need Eicha and Tisha B'Av to mourn even for yourself? We don't have to go in order, but whoever wants to address that two-sided question, please just dive in. Diane, looks like that was a lot. It was a big question, huh? You gave a how long do we have?
Yeah, I mean, I could, if that was an invitation to jump in, I guess I could. I think the world is too much. I think Lamentations is too much. And I think we're limited creatures and it's impossible to take it all in. And I have no idea how we take it all in. I really have no idea. I think post-pandemic and in the face of climate crisis, this book and this day makes so much more sense to me, not less sense. It's interesting. Tamar said something interesting about Ezekiel, the therapist saying Ezekiel was completely, those endless verses about violence against women were insane. And I think that's true. On the other hand, I'm at a point in my life where I feel like if you give any comment, even if you think it's crazy, a context, and this is not to justify it, then you will understand it, then it's not insane. Like the most insane things in the world, if we fully understood like what was in the person's mind or what was in the group's mind and the social conditions that produced them and the psychological conditions, then I feel like we could, for a moment, imaginatively and with empathy, occupy that space, whether we want to or not, because it's so ugly. That's a different question. It reminds me of Robert De Niro, who said he's willing to imagine himself into any evil character in any age, in any film, except for Trump. That's one role. So like, where, and this also relates to Tamara's point, like, once you imagine women having power then and not victimized, then evil enters the equation. So where do we want to go with our imaginations? Where do we want to go? And I feel like Torah invites us and gives us a method to take in more of the truth of the world, with all the critiques and the processing and the contextualizing, but, to take in that power. It gives us a method. The Beit Midrash, if it's not this, then I don't want it. If it's not a method for understanding the truth of the universe, I'm not that interested. What does this all have to do with the world? So did I answer?
It was great. And I think you went back to a theme that you started with earlier, which I love, like about humility. Like you gave permission. I mean, I think what I heard is you gave permission that if this all feels overwhelming, that's real, and that we don't have the capability to absorb all of this and to approach that with humility. And yet you also challenge us to be brave and to lean into it. There's something to be learned by confronting this, even if we can't assimilate all of this emotionally at one time. Thank you.
And even if it is horrible.
Yeah.
Right, to use our imaginations to get behind the horror.
That's great. Thank you. Megan.
Yeah, I want to jump in. Diane, I love how you started, like the world's too much. And that's the truth. Like if we could, have control over the world, then maybe it wouldn't be too much. And so to me, then you said, yes, Eicha is, but to me, then of course, Eicha is not too much, because if things like this are real, it can't be too much, because we have to push ourselves to acknowledge the truth of other people's realities as much as we have bandwidth for empathy, but also to change them. Those of us, consider myself highly privileged, a number of us have mentioned that, like if we hide out and pretend the world's not horrible, then we're not going to use our power to make change. So to me, the more we can use Eicha in that way. But I want to actually answer your question, Mike, in a different way, which is, I am a disciple of This Is Real and You're Completely Unprepared by the late Alan Liu. And the way that he writes about how Tisha B'Av sets us up for the high holiday cycle. And so this question of Tisha B'Av sort of breaks down our walls and reminds us how broken we are and gives us the kick in the tuchus we need to start to do the real work that's going to get us through the holidays. And that for me is like, the shock's okay if it starts me off. And it really does. It's like, oh wait, Rosh Hashanah is coming soon, not just logistically, but emotionally. And I think if we, what are we lamenting? I mean, there's a lot that we've lost this year. We've lived in a broken world. If we can be deep in that painfully for 25 hours and then say, okay, what am I going to do over the next couple months internally, communally? If Tisha B'Av stands alone, both, without the prep that a bunch of us have been talking about and without the post, then I do think it's neither effective And it might just be shock for its own sake. But if we really understand where it's coming from and then use it to propel us forward, its too muchness will be worth it.
Great. Shani, yeah.
You know, I want to lift up something that Dianne alluded to, but didn't say explicitly here, but she did say in our conversation before this panel, which she described Eicha as despair lishma, just like despair just for the sake of despair. And it really made me think about, I think Rav Soloveitchik has an understanding of Tisha B'Av as sort of like the reverse mourning, where we're moving from almost like shloshim, but the 3 weeks, then to the 9 days, which are like the 7 days of mourning, then to sort of the day of like rupture and despair. And so I think that it's easier for me to relate to Eicha in that way, in the idea that, you know, when we're in such a state of grief, when it's so sudden and in that moment, in some way you have to forgive whatever is being said, and people are at their worst state. You can't trust almost, you know, what they share and how they share it. They can't be held accountable. And so if I look at Eicha in that way, I can relate to this text more readily. I think if it's to actually, so in this way, I actually disagree with Dianne and Megan that if it's meant to sort of step as a stepping stone to now make change, I don't think it's an effective text. I don't think this does that for me, because I don't think, if anything, it's distracting. All I can think about every time I read it is like, what? This is crazy. This is bananas. But if it's an expression of just emotional raw grief, and the idea that we need to make room for emotional, again, despair lishma, then I think that's fine. I think, and then something else I think that I'm just moved by is also Tamar sharing, you know, the idea that it's just so interesting that both in Eicha and even in Song of Songs and Shir Shirim, you have men sort of using women to express emotions that for whatever reason they can't express as themselves, as their own male selves, whether it's their, you know, love of God or, you know, again, or this intense pain of feeling violated. You know, I think that it's beautiful. And I think at the same time, it doesn't, in so doing, it doesn't actually necessarily get at the real lived experience of any of the people that may have actually gone through something like this. And so again, I think that it's such a fascinating text to analyze from that perspective. And for me, it's not a stepping stone, but it's an exploration into that intense moment of grief for these people.
Yeah. Shani, thank you for sharing. There was like a number of really important idea bombs that you just dropped on us that we don't have time to unpack all of them, but you added a new dimension, which is, we've talked about humility, which you talk about in terms of understanding that some of the problems of this text might just be raw, unfiltered. And, you know, if someone were to say something outlandish at the funeral of a loved one, in their hesped, in their eulogy, like, you would forgive them, right? That's what happens sometimes. So that's a beautiful, and that's also a different approach, right? In other words, you're not seeing Judaism in text as something external. This is a family story with all of the messiness of family, and that is a lens for how to approach tradition with different eyes. And I also think that you added this element, while Megan talked about using this to propel us to act for justice. What I heard you saying also here is like, this is meant to open our empathy, and that part of the way you achieve a more just world is not just through action, but empathy is the tool that allows you to understand and assimilate someone else's pain by starting with opening up your own, right? You can't have a hardened heart about your own story and try to do justice in the world. So I'm looking at the time, I'm trying to figure out if we should ask one more question. I think what we should do is give folks a last thought. So Tamar, maybe you'll bring us home.
Yeah, I just want to relate to the phrase despair lishma. I think it's a very dangerous expression. I know it's true. I know the feeling either. But I feel that Judaism is the fight against despair, and we shouldn't. Pain is we should relate to Eicha as pain, not as despair. Despair is a different level. It's giving up, and it's joining the Sitra Achra somehow. But I do want to say one more thing that wasn't mentioned, and I really feel it's strong, talking about grief in Eicha, a Jewish grief, that I actually feel that it's a sin a little bit to do such a serious grief after we do have the state of Israel. And we are, Yerushalayim is complicated morally. I'm the last to say that it's not. But it's still flourishing, zkenot v'zkenim v'eladim in the streets. So it's not, something is wrong here. If we want to fast, if we want to say Eicha, sababa, but we still need to do either mesiba, a feast, but a halachic ritual of a feast in the end, or read some grateful, text hodaya, thanking God for that we're in the opposite sort of existence. And yes, we should think all day before we get to the end about the horrors in Jerusalem now, but it's not only horrors.
Right. So Diane, and then Shani in 3 minutes.
I just want to qualify what I think I meant by despair lishma. It's not advocating for despair, God forbid, but that there should be a space for us to express that voice. And I actually feel it's the opposite. I feel like if we get to express the voice, then we can leave the grief behind. But if we have to suppress it all the time, then we can't. If we get to express the voice, then that will ultimately lead us to action. And one more brief thought is that I just had this quick imagination that God forbid the world should be, the entire world should be flooded or consumed by fires. And we look back on this panel, right? What would we think about what we said today? And what would we need to say if that did happen? What would we think about this conversation and the privilege and the luxury of this conversation? So I just wanted to share that.
Thank you. Shani, you're going to get the last word. And then I want to share with you some of the upcoming events, learning events still happening today. So Shani, bring us home.
I'm so unworthy, but for this last word, but I just wanted to share that apparently Rabbi Norman Lamb, and there have been many articles on whether or not Tisha B'Av should have been canceled once the state of Israel was founded. And actually in my learning, also Ibn Ezra quotes, a commentator on the Bible, quotes an example of a tzaddik he mentions who won't read a certain text because it makes God look bad. And so I feel like, we should walk away not thinking that this, this conversation is not relevant or useful. It's so relevant. We've been talking about it just as long as we've been talking about Megillat Eicha. So just thank you.
Amazing. So first of all, I want to thank Tamar and Diane and Megan for being on our panel today. I want to thank Shani and Amira for all their work in making this happen. And to let you know that coming up at 1:30 Eastern is some learning with Professor Ziva Reimer Hassenfeld, who's going to be doing a deep dive on the book of Eicha. If there were other issues that you wanted to explore to get a better sense of its meaning or the framework, and she's absolutely wonderful. And we would be excited were it not Tisha B'Av, but we'll endure it nonetheless. And later today at 2:45 Eastern, Shani is going to be co-teaching with Zvi Hirschfeld, who's one of the longtime beloved faculty in Israel at Pardes, about the meaning and purpose of the morning rituals connected to Tisha B'Av. So wanted to thank everyone again. And I think in some ways, which I guess is the sign of any good conversation in Judaism, there are dialectics. And the conversation today, I think, weighs me down because it unearths and excavates some of the challenges and some of the missing voices in our tradition. And on the other hand, it gives me a great deal of hope and optimism because of the richness of ideas and possible spiritual and ritual meanings that come out of that tension. And so like all good Jews, I think I'm left a little bit in betwixt and in between, not fully satisfied, but also hungry for more in a lot of ways. So thank you for such thoughtful insights. and wishing you a meaningful rest of the fast. And Tamar, wishing you a good end of the fast very briefly in Israel.